Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks for having me to the AI Socratic Society. So yeah, for those who didn't hear, I'm an applied research scientist here at Element AI. I guess just to give you a little background on sort of where I'm coming at. So I went to the University of Alberta where there's a large poker group, including the group that did this work. They did this a little bit after I left, and so I was sort of curious to figure out what they had done, and so this gave me a good opportunity to deep dive into it, and in particular, it mixes some things that I'm really interested in, this combination of machine learning methods and more classical search methods and things like that. So that's essentially why I picked this paper, and yeah, and thank you to Wasim and Stefania for facilitating it as well. Also wanted to give a thank you to Mike Bowling, who's one of the authors and the main PI on this paper. I emailed him and he sent me some of his slides, and I didn't use them directly, but I've definitely got a lot of inspiration from his slides and even his talk. Same thing for Mark Langto, who has a lot of work on CFR, and so he was very nice enough to send along slides. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to start this first section of the talk before the break. I'm going to go through just an introduction to game solving and poker itself, and then some game theory basics. And then we're going to talk about DeepStack itself. So many of you probably remember Minimax algorithm, the alpha beta algorithm, these classical algorithms for how to solve perfect information games. If I gave you a state like this in tic-tac-toe, right, what you would do essentially, I mean, even not just with the algorithm, but even just in your head, is you'd probably think about the possibilities of if I made these several different actions. So in this case, there's what, 5 of them? And then you would think about what are the outcomes of those. So what are the things that the opponent could play, and then vice versa. And then you would kind of say, well, in this case, the O player would win. Here I'm the X player. In this case, the O player would win again. They can immediately win. You know, these other ones, the O player would win. But in this one here, I can guarantee a win by the X player. And so now I would say, all right, I can look at these sub-games and push this up to the top state that I'm in and say, all right, now I know that if I play appropriately, this is a win for the X player, right? And that's essentially how you would solve a game like this. You'd enumerate out this tree below and back things up, right? And so this really comes down to this idea of independent subgames, that you're able to split up this search tree into different pieces, solve the moves below, and then push things back up and put them together to solve it. Okay. An important part here is how I got to that state doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what exact sequence of moves put those O's and X's into that initial state, right? Whether I put the top left X first or whether I put the bottom right X, it does not matter. I can just think forward. I don't have to think above me, right? I don't have to think about how I got to a state. And this has been really super powerful in many games, right? At least, you know, theoretically, you could do this all the way up from the bottom of the game, these terminal states all the way up to the top, right? And theoretically, you could do it to any of these perfect information games like tic-tac-toe, like chess or Go. Checkers has actually been solved this way. Like the whole game, which is 10 to the 20 states, has actually been solved this game by Jonathan Schaefer and colleagues. But this is not a practical solution for things like Go or for chess, right? In that case, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can you elaborate on perfect information game?
Sure. So perfect information game, that's the wrong direction. Perfect information game is the idea that I can see everything about the game that I need to know. There's nothing hidden. It's not like poker, which we'll get to in a second, where one player sees cards that the other player sees, right? Everybody sees the chessboard. Everybody knows where all the pieces are. There's nothing that nobody knows about, right? And that's very important to this idea of these subgames, is that I don't need to think about what other people have done. Randomness, you can still do something like this. You just have to, you can still go forward, you don't have to think back.
You still call it perfect information if there was a random component?
That would be a perfect information non-deterministic game. Yeah, that would still be perfect information. You essentially end up in your tree with random areas where you kind of have to solve. You can almost think of it as your opponent in some ways. Just now you're thinking more expectations.
Think of backgammon. Backgammon is a good
Backgammon is a good example. Yeah, that's still a perfect information game. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. These are also deterministic games. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. So in these very large games like Go or chess, what you typically instead do is you think of like something like this. You look ahead a few steps, right? You look ahead a few steps. You kind of think about how good you're doing in this region. You usually use, say, some kind of evaluation function at this like bottom of this little search tree that you're looking at, because you can't look at the whole space. You use that to evaluate the part of the search tree that you're in. You then, after evaluating that little piece of the search tree, you pick an action. Then maybe your opponent picks an action, and then you repeat. So again, you look at what's below you up to some depth, because you can't go all the way down, and continue on and so forth, right? Even AlphaGo is basically like that, right? AlphaGo is using Monte Carlo tree search, so it's not using quite the balanced tree that I'm putting there, but it still is doing something very similar, where it's searching ahead to possible trajectories. It uses its evaluation function, which has been learned offline using reinforcement learning, and then it backs this up in order to evaluate moves in that area of the tree. Any questions there? Okay. That's my favorite way to spin AlphaGo, by the way. Yeah, so you would do this again, but this independent subgame thing is really important. This idea that I can like split it across different actions, think of them independently, right? I can take an action, I can put the X in the left corner, and think about how that would affect, that becomes a search tree itself, and vice versa. This recursive nature of the search tree becomes really important in this independent task. Again, also I don't have to think about what happened above. Okay. This work on DeepStack is not specific to poker per se. The method that's certainly their domain that they're using here, and I think so having a little bit of knowledge of poker is useful, but if you're not, if you're new to poker, it's fine. You just need to know a few things, right? So essentially, the way the game works is you start with no cards. This is called a pre-flop around, but you know, that word's not too important. Each player is forced to bet a little bit at the beginning, so they start with a stack of chips on both sides. In this case, 20,000. One player has to put in 100, and one player has to put in 200. It's essentially just to push actions in the beginning, or to encourage acting at the beginning. After that happens, they both get cards. They both get a set of 2 cards that the other player did not see. So if I'm the blue player here, I do get to see my cards, but I don't know what the yellow player's cards are. Then there's a betting round. So the object of the game is essentially to have the best cards, right? And so if I think that that's a good pair of cards that may lead to good things later, maybe we'll bet more, right? So maybe I'll bet and I'll put that pot up 400. The opponent can then respond with a bet. In this case, they're saying I'm not going to bet at all. That's fine. Then we get a new set of 3 cards. Right? This is called a flop. So you've got this set of 3 cards being revealed as called a flop. There's then another round of betting. Things go back and forth. Those are your main actions as a player, are essentially bets. Right? After this round of betting, there's another card that gets revealed. There's another round of betting. Another card gets revealed. Essentially what will happen is we'll both reveal cards. Then from the 5 public cards, the cards in the middle, and your own 2 cards, you make the best set of 5 card hands. If you don't know what the best set is, it doesn't matter too much. You can think of having a pair of things. So in this case, player on the right has 3 jacks because there's 2 jacks in the middle, and they have 1 jack, right? Whereas the player on the left has, what do they have? 2 aces and 2 jacks, because of those 7 cards, that's the best 5 that they can take. So you don't need to necessarily know what the ordering is. You just need to know that an ordering exists, right? So I'm at the beginning of the game, I'm looking at my cards thinking, okay, this can lead to good things for me, or this can lead to bad things for me. And I'm betting accordingly. Any questions there? Okay, cool. In terms of, oh yeah, so then in this case, the left player would lose the pot. So there was 12,000 chips in the pot. That corresponds to the left player had bet that, so they're going to actually lose that, and the right player will have won that. Okay. So just, wrong direction. There we go. So in terms of, again, the one other thing I want you to know about is just a little bit more about betting. So in this kind of poker, this is no limit heads up poker. Heads up just means 2-player. The no limit's the more important part here. Well, actually 2-player is important too. So if one player bets, right, the other player can then go higher than their bet. And then the other player has an option to say all in, which essentially just means all of my remaining chips. So that's a key part of this problem, is that you start with 20,000 chips. So essentially you have almost 20,000 actions in every spot. Not quite, but approximately that many. You have one more option as well. So let's say they went all in here. So now in order to move the game forward, you have to match how much they put into the game. And this left player can choose to what's called fold, which is essentially mean to forfeit this game. And if you forfeit the game, it means essentially what's in the pot goes to the player who did not forfeit. Cool? Okay. So just to contextualize this a little bit, there's been a lot of work in AI poker. This has really become one of the I don't know, I guess this is one of those games that has really spurred a lot of research. A lot from Alberta. CMU has done a lot of work on this as well. A lot of communities around the world, a lot of hobbyists, as you can imagine, as well. Going back to 2007 when they statistically tied in a 2-player game where there was no all-in bets, that's heads-up limit. To the last couple of years, there was DeepStack that in this paper beats pros and heads-up no limit. CMU came up a year later and really beat pros. I'm not talking about that work too much, at all. And then CMU came with Pluribus this year, which actually beats now in a 6-player version of the game, which is really impressive. But I wanted to kind of go back to the basics before not basics, but I wanted to go back a few steps before I thought about these other things as well. It actually goes even really farther back. So von Neumann was really obsessed with poker as well. He viewed the whole idea of decision making in AI as he thought poker was the perfect example of where people have to think without perfect information. There's non-determinism. So people has been thinking about this type of work for a long time. Okay, so let's think about how you would decompose in poker, because this is really the crux of this work. Or what the challenges of doing so are. So I can kind of think I'm going to try and do something like I did in those other games, right? But the issue is, right, if I'm the blue player here, so I'm at this, say, position in the game, I don't know what my opponent's players have. And their actions have kind of given me hints about that. So for example, they may have these 2 jacks, which would be really good here, because now they would have 3 jacks already, right? Or they may have these 2 twos. I don't know. But the point is, I have to reason about both of those possibilities. And the likelihood of one over the other is something that they will have given me clues about based on the actions. So if they think they have really good cards, you would expect them, at least on average, to be more aggressive. But if they have weaker cards, you would expect the opposite. You expect them to maybe fold very quickly. You would expect them to at least not raise very much. And so because of that, you can't really forget what you've done. You have to actually remember the full history of the things that you've seen. Yeah.
Clearly there's bluffing to some extent.
Yeah.
Has anyone done an on average, do people bluff less than they don't bluff? Can you say that on average, even with bluffing included, or do you know?
I don't know if that's statistically shown, but I would guess it would have. I would guess people don't bluff as much as. I mean, they're certainly bluffing, right?
Right.
And in these kinds of games, a bluff can essentially be thought of as a stochastic policy where you're doing what you think is suboptimal. And maybe we'll get a little bit to that later. But I don't know for sure. I would guess people are bluffing less often than they're playing aggressive, just because otherwise your opponents would just take advantage of that by knowing you're bluffing more often.
Right. You have to establish trust.
Yeah.
Trust.
That's right.
Yeah.
So theoretically, is there the best policy, the best strategy, or is it paper, rock, scissors game, stochastically?
Well, the answer is both. So rock, paper, scissors has an optimal policy too. It's randomly played 1/3 of each. There's the same thing here. So there is a theoretical best policy. That's the Nash equilibrium. I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but yeah. Did you have a question too? Okay. So your action history, the things that the other player has done, are going to give clues about what they have, and vice versa, right? What I'm doing is going to give them clues about what I have, and that's something I got to keep in mind too. In fact, because of that, right? Because from the opponent's, I keep forgetting that's the other button, right? From the opponent's view, they don't know what I have either, right? And because of that, right, I can be in not just that state there. I could have this set of cards from their view. So I could be in any one of these states. So I actually, and this comes back to the bluffing question, I have to think about what I would have done in those states in order to hide a little bit of what I do have. So I can't just think about my current set of cards. I basically have to think about every possible set of cards that I can have, right? And this essentially breaks all this decomposability thing. Like it makes it very hard because now I have to think about, you know, the breadth of the tree and above me as well. So it's not as straightforward as one would think to take those local search methods and apply them here.
In the case of chess, so for example, there are, I don't know, 1,000 ways to go from that place, right? Now, we don't know what the other player would play, right? Like, what would they do? So I guess they're not infinite. There are finite amount of possibilities here as well. Like you know you have these 2 cards, and you know there are 3 cards on the table. So the possibilities of the cards that they can have is 2 of something.
That's right.
I don't know, 50.
There's 52 cards, so they
47.
essentially have 52. Well, you're right.
247, right?
50,
so
47
they are,
choose to.
so they are like finite.
That's
and
right.
what is the difference between these 2? And there are 2 options. Either they're bluffing or not. So 2 subtrees.
Well, it's not just about. So you're right. So they could have 47 choose 2 cards here.
Times 2. Like, I don't know, because of the bluffing and not bluffing.
It's essentially 47. Well, it's 47 times 46, actually. It's much larger than that. Right? They could have any pair of possible other cards. So it's 47 choose 2. And you're right. But because of that, because they have like, I don't know, that's going to be almost 50 by 50, so that's like 2,500-ish. Right? They could have almost 2,500 possible pairs of cards. So it's not even just about bluffing or not bluffing. It's more like bluffing a little bit, bluffing a lot. They may have the strongest hand. They may have the weakest hand. I may have to think about all of those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess, but it's again, it's a finite.
It's finite, but it's big.
Of happenings, right? Like set of futures. So what is the difference between this and the perfect information game? That's what I meant. So
it is, and that actually comes. So it's finite, yes, but you don't know which of them it is in. So here's a big difference. I can play optimally in chess with a deterministic policy because I can always figure out in my current state what the best thing is to do because I don't have to hide anything. Here I have to hide things, so that's why my policy, the optimal policies have to be random, at least to a certain extent, right? And even poker players do this. I know I'm not a poker aficionado, if you will, but I've heard like that. For example, one of the things that they'll do is they'll use their watch almost as a random number generator. They'll say like, you know, if there's 7 seconds left in the minute when I'm making this decision, now I have to, you know, I'm going to bluff versus not bluff. So that's a fundamental difference between perfect information and imperfect information games. Is because you don't know what they have and they don't know what you have, you end up having to have a stochastic policy, even though it is finite. Reason about the whole game simultaneous thing, and this actually pushed a lot of poker research in the past. Right, the game is way too big to solve, and so for many years, what they did was something more like this. They started with you started with the original set of states. Then you merged states and actions. So for example, you thought if there's 2 hands that you thought were very good, you could kind of say, well, I'm going to act in the same in both of them anyways. So I'm going to think of that as being the same state. So you're merging these things into what's called an abstract game. And then you can use various methods to solve these games, right? If the game is small enough, like rock, paper, scissors, you can come up with the optimal strategy because it's small enough. So if I push everything together and make it small enough, I can solve the game. I'll find a policy for that abstract game, and then I'll use a method for translating it back. So I'll try and think about, okay, you know, I said I'm going to act this way with the strong hands. I'm going to act that way in the original game as well. But there's a number of challenges there as well. So it worked really well in that limit version of poker that I mentioned. They were able to beat professionals that way in that limit game, which is in some sense the smallest game that humans play. Because they were able to abstract, that game had 10 to the 14 states, and they were able to push that down into 10 to 11 states, and then that was small enough that they could solve it. In no-limit poker, though, you're going from 10 to the 100, actually states is not the right word here, it's decision points. You're going from 10 to the 160 decision points and trying to push it down into 10 to the 11. So that's a huge loss of information. You're both like pushing too many states together that you're losing too much of the like inherent versions of the game that you're just not able to translate from that small game to the big game. Another part of this that is a real challenge is this notion of translation, right? In my little game, I not only have to restrict what I know about the cards because I'm pushing them together, but I'm also restricting the number of actions I'm considering, both myself and the opponent, because it's the only way I can get it small enough. And so what happens is I may think, okay, I can only so one of the things they'll often do is say, okay, I can only maybe take 4 actions. And my own opponent can only take 4 actions, and that's the case in the small game. But then when I actually go play the real game, my opponent's not actually forced to take those 4 actions. So if they take something outside that, my abstract game is maybe not as representative of the real game as it should have, or would have been ideally. Okay. Overall, I'm just saying this is difficult. Any questions on that, though? Yeah.
How did you get that 10 into raised to 160? Where's that number from?
Where's that number coming from? I took it, essentially a paper has said this is the number, and I'm trusting them. I mean, so there is a combinatorial argument about so at every state you can almost make 20,000 actions, and it's some kind of mix of the number of possible deals, which is easy to calculate, and the number of possible actions. So it's a rough number. I mean, 10 to the 80 is the number of atoms in the universe. So bigger than that is big. I think that's maybe, yeah. And they know it's bigger than that. So.
How does that relate to 10 raised to 14?
Say that again?
10 raised to 14 versus what's?
So 10 to the 14 was the smaller version of poker. That was the game they were able to beat before. Yeah. And they're still stuck with this idea that it's hard to solve a game that's bigger than 10 to the 11, 10 to the 12-ish. So that's why if you're going from 10 to the 160, you really have to push it down a lot. But the previous game was, when you have only limit hold'em, where you only have fewer actions, that's what makes it much bigger. Yeah.
Do you have a sense, so for limit poker, so checkers you said is 10 to the 20.
Yeah.
So what makes it that checkers is exactly solvable and limit poker is?
So it actually is exactly solvable now, but it's at the limit of it. And essentially it's because it's non-deterministic and perfect information. So whereas checkers is a game where you're able to, it's a deterministic perfect information game, so you essentially just traverse the tree once. Here, the algorithms look more like, if you know value iteration or in reinforcement learning, it's one of these things where you have to keep doing sweeps, and you only guaranteed to converge in the limit, and that can take so now you're not just doing one sweep, you have to do an infinite number of sweeps, and that's what limits it. Okay. Yeah, so now what they're doing here, though, is they actually did figure out a way to decompose the game that allows for that sort of depth-limited subgame solving that they do. That's one of their big contributions here. That uses a neural network-based value function for those depths. And then they put it together to significantly beat top poker players. So that's essentially what we're talking about here. Okay. I'm going to give you a brief primer on game theory stuff. I don't know how familiar people are with. Who has heard of a Nash equilibrium before? Okay, who's heard of a best response before? Okay. All right. That's probably what I was expecting. All right. So, yeah. So I'm giving probably a little bit more basic or fundamental stuff here than I suspect is often done at these talks, just because I figured people would be less familiar with game theory things, and I like talking about it, so it's fun. So we're going to call a state here. We're still going to have this notion of a state, and it's going to be a history of actions. So that's going to be both actions by the players and actions by the dealer, if you will. The chance is what's called. right? And so a state is going to be perfect information in some sense. But that's not what an individual player sees. An individual player instead sees what's called an information set. And so an information set is a set of states that the player cannot distinguish between. So that's a combination of player histories, like actions that the opponent has taken, and the public information and your own information. So for example, here we have this action history where the player can see, the blue player can see the middle 3 cards and its own 2 cards. And it doesn't know whether the opponent, the 2 states, this state here is in the information set, and this state is also in the same information set. Okay. Similarly, from the yellow player's perspective, that state is in the same information set as the previous one. Right. So they're disjoint sets, if you will, or they're overlapping sets. Okay. Now a strategy is, so we're going to denote it as sigma p for player P, is essentially just a table saying the probability of taking, is the probability taken of each individual action in an information set. So again, an information set is something they can't distinguish between. So it's essentially the probability of this blue player taking each of the possible actions, so a table like that, in this information set. Okay, and we're going to say 2 policies together, one for player 1 and one for player 2, is called a strategy profile. Okay, this thing I think I overkilled here, but so if we have this history here of these 2 cards being dealt, or these 4 cards being dealt, player 1 betting, player 2, or blue player betting, yellow player betting, blue player betting, you can think of like the probability of a sequence of things happening. So given whatever policies the 2 players have, we're going to use this pi sigma to be the probability that you see that history. That includes chance. So that's just the product of these probabilities on the right, because that's the probability. I'm making up a fake strategy here, but that's the true strategy of that being dealt. You can also think of just the probability of chance here. So for this history, the part that chance contributed to it is just that first bit. So 1 over 52 choose 2 times 50 choose 2. And you can think about the probability that each individual player contributed to this. So the blue player contributed to 0.2 times a 0.1, whereas the yellow player only contributed to 0.1. Right? And then you have this relationship at the bottom where the policy of this history given this strategy profile is going to be given by the part that player 1 did plus the part that, multiplied by the part that player 2 did, multiplied by the part that chance did. Yeah.
So on the previous slide, when you're talking about information sets, I just want to make sure I'm not confused. So an indistinguishable set, so like there's 2 ways to think about that, and I don't know which one is correct. So one example is where, because I don't see that they have 2 jacks, it could be, like, I don't know what their cards could be at all. So it could be 2 jacks, it could be an ace king, it could be whatever, and it's all equivalent from like what I see perspective.
That's right.
But, okay, so that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is like, well, but like they would have bet differently if there had been 2 aces instead of 2 jacks, so like those 2 states are technically not the same. But that's not what you're looking at when you say information set.
No, we're talking literally, yes, you're right. It's the first one. It's that I don't know which one they have. I may have a belief over which one they have, but you're right. It's just the set of histories that get grouped together in the sense that theoretically they could have either one. Yeah. Okay. There's the notion of terminal states here. So terminal states are just endgame states, right, which is going to happen in poker after a fold or after you've shown your cards. And then those terminal states have a utility value to each player, right? And that's just how much each player has won or lost in that case. In these kind of zero-sum games like poker, a key property is the zero-sum property is key and essentially means that, there should be a negative there. The one player's utility is going to be the negation of the other player's utility. So if I win 1,000, the opponent has to lose 1,000 and vice versa. Yeah.
What's the significance of the terminal states? Because the game is not over, just one round is over.
So yes, you're right. So So we're going to have a slightly simplified version of poker here, where we're going to assume that we're, like, one round is the game. Yeah. You could think about multiple games. So another way people play these tournament games are where, so you start with 20,000, and then maybe you win 5,000 off me, and then the next round, you start with 25,000, and I start with 15,000, and we play until one of us goes to 0. But here we're just going to simplify it and say each round is one game. But the same thing would apply. You would just have to essentially like add one game on top of another. Like it's just a bigger tree, if you want to think of it that way. Right? And then your terminal states would be when someone gets to 0.
I don't think I understand why it's a bigger tree, because I don't understand why there's no dependence of one game on another. I guess the amount of money you have and what you have access to in your pie. But that's the only thing that would carry, right?
So, yeah, and I know people who play poker will play differently, because they'll say, like, if I have a lower amount, I should just lean into variance and hope I get lucky. So they do play differently, but I don't know. There's possibilities you could decompose that as well.
You could also adjust to your opponent. So you see, oh, he bet loose. Then you would play it very differently if you think that your opponent's playing tight.
Yeah, that's true. You could
It
also
feels
like.
very complicated
But
to train.
would a good player do so?
I mean, a perfect player would not, but a good player definitely does. But and there's also, I mean, this is the Nash equilibrium. So a perfect player. Well, actually, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah. Anything else? I think I'm literally on the next slide. Oh no, not quite. Okay. Now you have a notion of expected utility. So if you're not in a terminal state, your expected utility is essentially the probability that I'm going to get to the, well, from a particular state, well, actually this is from the beginning of the game. So it is, given the strategy profile, it's a weighted sum of the utilities that'll hit each terminal state, right? That the probability that I hit each one of those. I thought I had another slide here. All right, what are you going to do? And as you can imagine, I'm trying to come up with a policy that's going to maximize expected utility. But let's first think about a best response. So best response is if essentially the best policy I could have. So here policies are essentially fixed. I have my table. I'm sticking with my table. And a best response is essentially, if you gave me your table, I could go and spend like a millennium figuring out the best strategy to face you. It doesn't mean I know your cards. It means I know perfectly, it means how you're playing, and so I can come up with the best strategy that'll do as well in expectation. Okay? A Nash equilibrium is then, the simplest way to think of a Nash equilibrium is essentially two policies that together are best responses of each other. It's like a fixed point. Neither one wants to deviate from what they're doing because they know they're doing the best they possibly can against the opponent. And John Nash in the 30s or something, he showed that one exists for every possible game. I think 30s is too early, but something like that. Pre-war, I believe. Okay. And this is what a lot of these, when I say solving the game, this is largely what people are looking for. They're looking for Nash equilibrium. Because they want to be as, it's a conservative policy, it's a conservative strategy because you're sort of guaranteeing, you're thinking of your opponent as ultra rational. And that has a lot of advantages because it means you're going to be, you might play defensive because of it, but it's in some sense like your best worst case, and it's a strong, you know, it's perfect play, if you will. Okay, yeah.
I was trying to think about whether that results in like a 50-50 chance that each player would win, but then I was thinking about like tic-tac-toe where someone can win but the other one can't, but like where does that go? In terms of chances that each side will.
So each side is just, you're right, so you can, so perfect play in something like chess, or actually I don't know about chess, in certainly tic-tac-toe is somebody is going to win. I believe that's the case in Go as well. So even if both players played perfectly, I think the first player has an advantage. I mean, it's such a minuscule advantage that I don't think it matters. Actually, it does matter because they switch who plays when they're like playing pro, I believe. Sorry, no, in Go, for example. So it can still have that one player loses. It just means that, you know, you're doing the best you can, right? And you're only losing because the other person's like as good as they can possibly be. Okay. So a key thing here is this notion of a counterfactual value. That becomes very important in poker. So it's a little bit different than that utility idea. So the utility idea was, you know, what is the average that I'm going to, what is the average overall possible histories, given that we're both playing this way? This here looks very similar, but you're kind of taking out, so when I'm looking at an individual history, I'm taking out my contribution to get there. So it's like, what is this weighted sum after this history? You know, well, sorry, it's weighted by the sum to get there, but I'm acting as if I pushed it to get there. So here, for example, if I look here, this is in some sense the utility of starting at history H. So it's the weighted sum of all possible outcomes of starting from that particular history. And then this part here is the probability of getting to H if player 1, you know, made all the actions to get there, like almost deterministically. So this is just, that's the contribution of the other players in chance. Okay, so it's kind of like a utility, but it's a little bit different, and it has some nice properties that become super useful. Okay.
What is the chance probability?
So it's this notion of weighting what other people can do. And in some sense, you can think of chance as an opponent. It's just an opponent with a fixed strategy. It's a little bit about capturing the likelihood of something happening, right? So I'm not going to, and that's largely what the left side of this is doing, is it's saying, for example, if I'm holding out hope that I'm going to get a royal flush, you know, I shouldn't put a huge weighting on that. So my counterfactual of that is pretty low.
I guess part of it is what cards you were adopted at the beginning.
That's right. Well, yeah. Well, all cards are equally likely, but like there's certain combinations of the cards that are very unlikely, right? Having 4 of a kind is very unlikely. So I don't want to, right? Let's say H here is almost a terminal state. I've gotten 4 of already. I shouldn't weight that too heavily because I got super lucky to get it. So it would have a high value on the right side, but it would have a low value on the left side. And then you can think of the counterfactual value of an information set as essentially being the sum of the counterfactual values for each of the individuals that are included, sorry, each of the histories in that information set. An important part of this is this counterfactual values are decomposable. So I can say, for example, that if H prime is this history that's given by H plus 1 more action, right? It's going to be equal, the counterfactual value of H prime is going to be equal to the counterfactual value of H multiplied by my probability of taking that action. The actual details are not too important. It's more this decomposability, which is, you know, you can kind of see where I'm thinking with this. Okay, and the algorithm that people use a lot to solve these poker games is this thing called counterfactual regret minimization, or CFR. This was figured out in 2007. I'm going to give a very broad overview of this, but it's a self-play algorithm that works as follows. So you're going to start with an arbitrary policy for both players, and then you're going to do forward and backward passes over all the histories. And I'm going to explain a little bit of what I mean in that. So you're going to keep doing forward passes and backward passes, and backward passes, each time updating the strategy. And the average strategy over time is going to be is guaranteed to have a Nash equilibrium. That's the nice theoretical property here. So yeah, on the way down, you're calculating those pies that I showed before. You're showing the probability that I'm going to reach every state. And then on the way up, I compute those counterfactual values and then update the policy using something called regret matching. I don't want to go too much into detail there, but the main thing is this go down, compute probabilities, go up, compute counterfactual values, and update your strategy. Okay, and you can just keep doing this, and in the limit, you're going to converge to the optimal policy. And the nice thing is there's even nice guarantees about like the amount of how far off you are. I think it's you can kind of bound how far off you are from a Nash equilibrium by like the square root of how many iterations you've done. So you actually have this almost this polytime algorithm essentially to solve these games. Do you have a question?
Maybe.
You had a half question. It looked like.
When you're computing counterfactuals, the thing that's changing is like your
policy's
sense of the
changing on it.
probability that you will get to the state H given what has happened already.
That's right.
Okay.
So on the
and
way-
also like the history of previous moves.
So
or
you actually
just-
have to go over every possible state to do this. That's why you can't do it for very large games. So you have to, if you have a 10 to the 14 problem, you have to go over all 10 to the 14 states on every iteration, calculating the probability that you'll hit that history. Then you'll get to the bottom, and you push all the way back, calculating the counterfactuals on the way up.
And when you're calculating the counterfactuals, it's like this path I just took down and all the other paths I have taken down before to get a sense of the probability that each state will be reached. Or
Well,
no?
you can calculate, because you're not actually dealing hands, you're actually literally just walking down the tree.
Yeah.
You can just do that product sum before that I showed, where you just multiply the, and I know both player strategies here. So I'm just multiplying their policy by my policy, by the chance, and I can perfectly calculate those probabilities. And then I just go up and sum it. So this is, again, it looks a lot like value iteration, or it's a dynamic programming algorithm, essentially. It's just dynamic programming using this regret matching thing. Yeah.
Right, so just to clarify, the policies in this case are not, they're not purely based on like my current information, like the information set, like what I can see, and that's it. It's
No, they are, sorry, they are
They
on your
are,
information
okay.
set. So you still have to, at each step up, you have to aggregate things by information set in order to calculate the counterfactuals,
okay, right.
or in order to come up
But-
with the policy. I
Okay,
should say.
right, but they include all of the history steps. So like in a game, it's not just my policy is like given this state, I'm like given this set of cards, I will do this. It's like given the set of cards and given that last time he bet this and 2 turns ago he bet that and 3 turns ago I bet that,
Yeah,
I will do this.
that's right.
It's like huge.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, that's why the game has 10 to the 160 states. And that's why you can't do that there. Yeah. But you actually can do it for smaller, like heads up, you can do it on. I'm sorry, on limit poker. Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about DeepStack. So DeepStack is going to do that resolving thing that I mentioned. So you're going to do that local search thing essentially by being very clever, essentially. Yeah. Yeah, in like 15 minutes, I think.
Is it okay if we take a break now?
Sure, if you want.
Yeah, there's a problem.
Oh, there's a problem?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break.
So essentially that idea of before of we're actually going to look at a piece of the tree, solve the piece of the tree, take an action, or once I have that that solved, I have my policy for my local action. I'm going to use that policy to select the action. Or sorry, I'm using policy and strategy interchangeably, I realize. So I'm going to have a strategy over my actions at that position. I'm going to stochastically select from those possible actions based on that strategy. I'm going to take an action. I'm then going to, this is going to be important for coming up with this decomposition, but I'm going to essentially calculate estimates of the opponent counterfactual values and what are called ranges. And then I'm going to let the opponent act, and I'm going to do the same. Wait for my next turn. So maybe the opponent's going to act. Maybe there's going to be a chance action. Then I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to set up a new subgame. And I'm using a trapezoid here. I'll explain in a second. So I'm going to set up a subgame, solve that, and continue. And that's what DeepStack does. Okay. So as an example, I'm going to have this history on the right, where I'm the blue player. I have ace and jack. Maybe I'm going to bet 100 to begin with, and the opponent will bet 400. I'll bet 400, and then we'll have the first 3 cards will come out. Okay. So I'm at this subgame, and it's a trapezoid, right? It's not a single point, because this is that information set idea. The fact that I have to treat it, because I know the opponent doesn't know what cards I have to think about all the possible cards I could have, because I'm trying to hide a little bit of what I have. Okay? And similarly, well, sorry, I'm going to put those together. So you can kind of think about, these are all the possible hands my opponent can have, given that I know what I have. And this is all the possible hands that my opponent thinks I may have. Right? So I kind of have to, essentially what they do is they think about that full subgame, what my opponent thinks I may have and what I think the opponent may have. Okay? Now, the key to do this, though, is I have to forget my action history. I have to figure out a way to do that, to forget the action history. And I need a way to think about so that I don't have to go all the way down to the bottom of the tree. I need that estimation process. And that's really what DeepStack is coming up with, those two big pieces. So let's think about history first. What we're going to do is we're going to come up with these idea of ranges. So these are player ranges, in some sense, my probability distribution over what I think my opponent could have. So imagine I actually had, again, my opponent's strategy, right? So I know the distribution. Well, at this step here, right, I know the exact distribution of possible player hands. Each one is 1 over 50 choose 2. So given that I know what my hand is, I know exactly that there's a uniform distribution over all other possible hands because nothing else has happened yet. All that's happened are cards have been dealt, right? Now, if the yellow player knows the blue player's strategy, what they can do is say, all right, if the player had this this pair of hands, they had a X probability of taking the action that they did of betting 100. If they had this other pair of hand, they have a Y probability of taking that action, and so on and so forth. And so they can essentially update that uniform distribution into something that's non-uniform using simply Bayes' rule, right? It's exactly what Bayes' rule is for, is that kind of idea of, I don't know what they had exactly, but I'm updating my beliefs about what they have based on the fact that I know the probabilities that they take each action, right? Questions there? Okay. And then I can do the opposite, right? The blue player can do the same thing at the next step, right? They can now create a probability distribution, a non-uniform probability distribution over yellow's hand if they had their strategy by doing the same kind of Bayes' rule update and vice versa, right? Now I actually get these new hands, and that actually now lets me further prune my distribution because now I can just zero out the impossible hands. Right. The opponent can know. I know now the opponent no longer has the jack and 2 of hearts. Okay. Again, this all assumes both players know each other's strategy. So how we're going to ignore action history, though, is essentially try and replicate that. So let's, for now, just think that we're going to all the way to the end of the tree. So if we had the player strategy, we could do it since we know our own strategy. So we can do it for ourselves. And what I mean by do it for ourselves is we can act as if the opponent knows what our strategy is and say, this is the best they could possibly know about us. Right? Because if you know your own strategy, you can just do that Bayes' rule update over your own actions in order to estimate exactly what they could possibly know about you. Does that make sense? Okay. No? Okay. So assume I gave, right, the best the opponent could know about me is to actually give them my strategy, right? So if I did that Bayes' rule update, because I do know my strategy, so I can do that Bayes' rule update as if I am them. And then that will essentially calculate the best that they could know about me. And what I mean by that is the probability distribution over the possible hands that I have. So it's acting as if they know my strategy, even if they don't. But it lets me at least bound what they could know about me. That's another way to think about it. Okay. So that's great. So what we're going to do, so yeah, if both players knew each other's strategy, you could create a subgame that ignores the history by just starting with those ranges, right? So you could kind of think of this fake public game where we're going to start with these 3 public cards. The pot's going to start off where the pot ended in the last case. And we're going to kind of do a new deal where we're going to deal the cards out to each player according to that distribution that we just calculated using Bayes' rule. Since that's the probability distribution over their hands, we can now just solve this similar game where that probability distribution becomes the possibility that I deal out those cards. This is an equivalent game. Yeah.
So essentially you converted the past actions history into probability of what cards that could apply, and now you're playing from there and you'd ignore the actual action.
Exactly. So I have two probability distributions, and I'm doing that. Yeah, precisely. All right. So I'm not dealing with the bottom problem yet, but that helps me at least cut off the top. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't know the other player's strategy, right? I know my strategy, but I don't know their strategy. But it turns out you don't need to know their entire strategy. So what they're going to do instead is they're going to still say, if the other player knew my strategy, I'm going to calculate some upper bound on the counterfactual values that they could have. And I don't want to go into this in too much detail because it takes a long time, and I've already explained a lot of things in a lot of detail. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to think about that's the best they could do from each possible history. So you're going to use that as kind of a proxy. You're going to think about, like, if we had gotten to this location, this history, right, and they know what they know about me, what's the best that they could have gotten going forward? So they're going to maintain these counterfactual values, so instead of maintaining that range. So it's like, how good is it for them to have brought this hand to this part of the tree? Okay? And they do sort of similar. So like you said, before we could have taken this game, and we could have said, okay, we're just going to start with these opponent probabilities as my distribution of hands that are going to be dealt. Here they're going to do it a little bit differently. So they're going to create this new fake game where the opponent gets the first action, and their first action is either play the game or don't play the game. And if they play the game, they go down into the regular game that we've already started. And if they don't play the game, they get the counterfactual value. And what the trick that this means is it means that I can't cheat by ignoring the earlier part of the game. So I have to be willing to give enough to the opponent that they want to play the game. So this is what allows me to forget the history. Is they still see my strategy. I don't see their strategy, but I see these counterfactual values, and I'm using it to construct this game that lets them force what they can at least get. Okay. Again, this is a really high level for this version. Took me a while to go through the details of this myself, and I'm still not 100% comfortable with it. But this is essentially the cleverness of how they're going to cut off the histories, is by creating these new fake games where the opponent actually acts first, and they can easily achieve a value. So you're going to not let them do that. So you're still going to have this distribution over card hands for yourself. And they have some distribution for card hands for the other player. I don't remember exactly how that works. But the player is going to play uniform, or you're going to then just do the standard CFR thing. So now, for all of these things, both players are going to start with their uniform distribution over actions. You're going to do the sweeps, and then you're going to converge to an optimal policy inside that subgame. Right? And again, if you're being too aggressive in this in the actual subgame, right, the opponent's Nash equilibrium will be at the top to just leave not play. Okay. I know that part's complex and not entirely clear. Any questions? Any thoughts?
Why would he leave not play? Like, what's the...
So you're creating this new fake game.
Yeah.
So okay. So the first node, this chance node. So in our case, what did we have? Oh, so we had 3 cards were played. So we don't know the identity of 49 cards. So the opponent can have 49 choose 2 possible hands. So what you're going to do is the chance node is going to deal out cards to the opponent, and then the opponent's going to be able to, or sorry, the chance node actually, I think it deals out cards. Yeah, it deals out cards to both players. And then the opponent's able to look at their cards and say, I want to play this game. And if they do, they will continue on in the regular game. And if they say, I don't want to play this game, they're going to just immediately get the counterfactual value. That'll be their utility. Like, that's how much money they will win. So they're incentivized to play the game only if you let them win a little bit down there. Right? And that forces me, that's like a trick to get around the idea of like forgetting the history. It's a trick that means I can't, Like they have to know sort of my strategy, and I can't force them to have like not wanted to get to this location by as much as they would want to for each of those hands. Any other thing that would help clarify this?
You're almost saying that you're kind of letting them win, right? So that they want to play the game.
That's right.
But
That's right.
there is a lot of chance element in terms of whether they win or you win, right? Because you never know the.
That's right.
So
But the whole, yeah, so because it's an upper bound on how much they can win if they got to that location, that's why you want to provide it to them so that they can win. So that, yeah, so that you can get a good strategy in the rest of the game. Okay. And the nice thing is you can do updates of these counterfactual values along the way. So you can update your point of range using those Bayes rule ideas. And then you can update the counterfactual values using some particular rules that I don't want to go into. But you can properly do it to keep the right range, to keep the right upper bounds, and do the appropriate thing. So now, how are we going to cut off the ball? Right? Because in order, we still, if we're at the beginning of the game, we still can't do this thing. So we're going to cut off the bottom by essentially using a value function at the bottom here, instead of going all the way there. That's going to estimate, roughly speaking, how good it is to get to that. Or sorry, how good everything is below. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to, on the way down, we're going to calculate the ranges for the players. We're going to calculate those probabilities of reaching each history, as CFR usually does. Then you're going to get to the bottom, and since you're not actually at terminal state, you're instead going to call the evaluation. Okay. And then you're going to use that to estimate what the counterfactual values are and push it back. Right? So what we're doing here, though, is essentially you're creating new subgames. This time you actually know the opponent's strategy. And you're going to use both strategies in order as a way to estimate what's the work. So the value function is going to estimate the counterfactual values of each of those informations. Okay. Yeah. So it's what would you have gotten if you had solved? You're trying to estimate what would you have gotten if you had solved the game. And then you're going to push back up, like before. You're going to get those counterfactual values, push them back up, calculate your strategy, and you keep going up and down as before inside that little bit. How are you going to do that value function? Well, so what they were looking at was, deep neural networks are shown to be a great way to do value functions in Go. Let's try here in Go. So they're going to create a neural network like this. It's actually, most of it is fairly straightforward. There's just a couple tricks. So the main thing is, again, we're taking in here, the inputs of the neural network, and your features, if you will, are going to be your card ranges. So the probability distribution over every other possible hand for the opponent. I'm saying for both players. The current pot and the public cards. And then what you're going to output are those counterfactual values. So this is, output is two vectors, one for each player. The counterfactual value for each possible hand for each possible player. Player one, player two. Right. So the left P1, the bars are like the probability of having that. Oh. That's what the bars are trying. And P2 is the probability of they have. Ignore the middle two.
Yeah, why is the bar just like on the output? What do those bars represent?
So the bars on the right are now going to be the counterfactual values. I don't really know. They shouldn't be bars. They would be like numbers. I mean, they are. But they are basically, think of it as like counterfactual value of having this set of cards is 2.5. Right? Whereas here, these are probability distributions.
How do we do the
So, yeah, so this is the idea that in that subgame, I'm starting both players as being, starting both as uniform. And then I do my all the way down to get, I do my pass downward, calculating the probability that each player would have gotten there. Or I have the strategy that they would have had, so I know the probability that they would have. I can calculate that at the bottom. And then I'm going to query the neural network with those numbers. So So I'm calculating that on the bottom, the downward pass. Anything else?
What is 7 days? 7 days?
Yeah, so they're going to, that was perfect timing. Yeah, so the middle is just like simple, fully collected. This is a very vanilla neural network. Right? The complicated part is the outside and maybe the other pieces. But the actual main guts is just 7 fully collected.
What's happening, the second part, they're bucketing some of these
Yeah.
combinations.
I'm going to get to that in a bit, because I think that's hard. The other part is the zero-sum thing. This is the only like non-vanilla part. Well, sorry, bucketing is also non-vanilla. But this part is also a little bit of a non-vanilla architectural choice. So what they're doing here is they need the counterfactual values to be zero-sum. So they need the outputs to add up properly. So they're going to do this thing where, so here's what you want to be the case. You want to be the case that given that probability of getting to a location and the counterfactual value, both players' sum should be equal to negation of one another. In order to force the network to do that, they're going to do this extra bit where they're going to take the sum of those two things. So this is the sum, the weighted sum over all the counterfactual values. That's going to be psi. That should be minus psi over 2. And they're going to adjust the counterfactual values by minus psi over 2, so everything adds up. And the really nice thing is it's still differential. So you're going to get zero sum now, and you're going to get differential, which is important. So that's that bit, and then bucketing, I'm going to hold on. Okay. So that was where the break's going to be. I guess we're not breaking.
Let's keep going.
Everything's still working?
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about building the component. I was going to do a recap both of it. But so essentially, right, you get 2 cards, then there's round betting, and there's 3 cards come out, betting, another card comes out, betting, another card comes out, betting, and you're at the end. Right? So the way they're going to do the sub games is they're not going to do it the way you would think of it in like chess, where you say, like, I'm going to look 5 steps ahead. They're going to instead define like clear breaks in the game. And so what they're going to do is if you're in the first 2 rounds, yeah. So if you're in the first 2 rounds, the sub game is going to go up to the reveal of the next card. So if I haven't seen the flop yet, I'm going to go into the reveal of the flop is where you're going to cut the game off, regardless of how many bets have gone so far. So you're going to do this resolving every time you're taking an action, but you're only ever going to go that far, right? So at the beginning of the game, maybe I'm solving this much, but at like halfway, after 2 bets, maybe I'm only solving this much. After that many bets, I'm going to solve that much, right? Similarly, if I'm in the flop area, so if I've already seen 3 cards, I'm going to solve it as far as seeing the 4th. And finally, if I'm at the end of the game, so if I'm anywhere in the last 2 phases of betting, I'm actually going to solve the end of the game because it's small enough now that I can do it. Okay? And they're going to have 2 neural networks here that they're going to train separately. The first one's going to give estimates after the first 3 cards have been shown. The next one's going to give estimates after the next card has been shown. So the first one's the flop network, and the second one's the turn network. They're also going to do this thing called, so they are going to use a little bit of abstraction here inside the subgame. So they're going to do these sparse look-ahead trees. So they're essentially going to cut the number of actions each player can play. However, they're not going to have that translation problem because they're still doing the counterfactual value updates properly while they're doing that. Now we'll come back to the bucketing question. So what they're doing here is, so think about that turn network. The turn network's trying to estimate, given 3 cards that are public, and given the player ranges, what is the counterfactual value for each possible card? So what you're going to have there is this slightly differently. There should be 50 choose 3 possible flops, right? Which is not 25 million, which should be divided by 2,400, so probably like 10 million. So there's 10 million possible flops. And you don't want to necessarily, you're having that as an input, so you don't necessarily want to just like have a separate, you can imagine like having a one-hop vector of 10 million entries, and that's not great. So what you're going to instead do is you're going to combine each private pair of cards with those 3 into clusters that are capturing strength. So you're essentially clustering, 3 public cards, that's 3, and 2 private cards. So every combination of those, actually that is 10 million. You're going to get every combination of those, and you're going to cluster those 25 million into buckets of 1,000 clusters, where roughly those are supposed to be strategically similar. This was stuff they did long ago, where essentially strategically similar means that the hands have the same expected value and variance. And then you're using just standard k-means clustering to come up with buckets of these cards. So now you're solving this. You are solving this, or not solving. You're getting values for these buckets instead, but it's going to help generalize. It means you're not going to need, right? Because otherwise you're going to have to do a lot of different, since there's 25 million possible hands, you're going to have to do a ton of training. Yeah. And they're going to do the same thing for the other guys.
So is this the same thing as like what they did with abstraction?
So it's exactly the way they did abstraction. So that's the way they would compress the game. Here they're not using it for compressing the game, but they're just using it for generalization across estimates of counterfactual values.
And that thing is not true. Like this part.
Say that again?
Like this part is not true. It doesn't get trained to map those 25. Yeah, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's k-means cluster. So you're doing unsupervised learning in order to do the bucketing. So that's done offline. And then once you have the buckets, that's where you're doing that compression. Right. So what you would then say is, right, you would take each one of your cards, your pair cards and the public cards, and you would say, okay, which bucket is that going to land in? So now, what's actually being taken, what's actually being taken as input to the neural network is going to be the pot still and the bucket picture. Or it's going to take a distribution over the buckets. Because you start with a distribution over hands, you're not going to have a distribution over buckets. And now the way they're going to train these is they're going to generate, let's think of the turn network, right, which again is after 3 cards have been dealt. They're going to generate 10 million such games, so 10 million such 3-card hands. And they're going to generate random player ranges. Then they're going to, turn is after 4 cards. So it's after 4 cards. So they're taking all possible 4-card games, and they are all possible 4-card games. You're going to generate 10 million of these 4-card games, and they're going to generate random ranges for each of them. So random probability distributions over. That seems kind of weird at first, but the idea is you're going to be using this on the down sweeps of CFR. So you're going to, since you're starting with a uniform policy, a uniform strategy, you're going to end up at the bottom with weird distributions. Because you're like the early iterations of this algorithm, you're going to have weird strategies. So you may end up at the bottom with weird distributions over the cards. So you need to allow it to have weird distributions that happen. So you're going to take 10 million of those types of turn games, combinations of turn games, and cards. You're going to solve the game below it. We're close enough to the end that we can solve the game fully using this approach. And then that's going to become a training example. Right? So before you get for each training example here is given by a combination of a randomly dealt cards, ranges, and now you're going to solve the game to get your counterfactual values, and then that's your training example. Right? Which is why it takes all of this CPU time. So they use 6,000 CPU cores to do training over 175 CPU cores. Any questions there? Okay, and then the flop network is sort of done similarly, except they're going to use 1 million. They're only going to use 1 million training examples because there's fewer flop possibilities. But they're going to do the same idea, although the one thing is instead of solving all the way to the bottom, because they can't, they're going to do the same subgame solving thing where they're going to use their turn network to get to the bottom piece of it. So they're now going to solve that in the middle piece of the game. So this takes less time on 20 GPUs and took half a year.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Why did you switch from CPU to GPU?
I have no idea, to be honest. I'm guessing because there's not as much. Do you have an idea?
So before that, the CPUs were for the CFR, but this one is for the
That could be. That might be it. Yeah. Maybe that part was unclear. Yeah, that's probably right. So they're probably using the CPUs to do the CFR.
And I think they're doing 1,000 iterations because that's a good amount of time that mimics human reaction time in poker, I think, when you actually play it in real time.
I think, yeah. And I think for the game that's small enough, it's also small enough to convert. I'm sorry, it's enough to convert.
Oh, yeah.
So this is all offline. Okay, so now they're playing against, so how are they going to evaluate this? The first way is they're going to evaluate against humans. So to do this, they recruited players with the help of the International Federation of Poker. So they got 33 players to sign up. They all self-identify, these are all professional poker players, these self-identified professional poker players. And they asked each one to pay 3,000 hands over this period of like a month, where there was some cash prizes for those people. It's actually really hard to evaluate in poker because it's so high variance. So you have to do a bunch of tricks in order to sort of get rid of luck and get it down. So as an example, so 50 milliblinds per game. So that's a metric for how good you're doing. 50 milliblinds. So we have the big blinds. Big blind was the amount that that first action has to be. And so you're thinking about, so a big blind is, how many thousandths of a big blind you win on average. 50 is approximately what professionals believe they need to make on average in order to actually make a living. Okay. So if you're able to beat them by more than 50, you're doing, you're essentially doing quite well, right? But the problem is the high variance part of this game means that if you have two players that are only about that much different in skill, it'll take like 100,000 games to tell the difference if you just take average play. So that's where you have to do clever variance reduction methods. And that was sort of one of the favorites they had, where they can do some variance reduction methods that get it down so you only have to play 3,000 games. Because no human being is going to sit down and take 100,000 games. So they're only going to win like $5,000.
That's 3,000, not 300,000.
No, 3,000. No, you're right. There's no case.